Falkingham. I'm a senior game programmer at Pickbot. It's not my So I'm here today to talk to you about tutorial systems. I've worked on a lot of them throughout my career, and there's a lot of things I don't like about them, particularly some of the ones that I myself have worked on, and then there's a lot of things that I do like about them. And I'm just here to share my learnings and what I think really does make a good tutorial system. So this is just the structure. I'm just going to tell you a bit about me, because I realize that most people here, except for maybe one person, don't know me. So I'll just go through myself. Then I've got some examples with code samples of actual real-world tutorial systems that have gone into games that I've worked on. And then I'm going to just summarize, explain some of the learnings that I feel you can take away from this. And then also I've just got a brief slide at the end, which is what makes a good tutorial system, which is just kind of a broad summary of everything else. And the cute little guy at the bottom is called Pog. Sorry, no, I'm sorry, on this one. It's confusing because it says the next slide on that side, sorry. So a little bit about me. I started game development right out of university. I didn't actually study game development. I studied software engineering down at Lincoln University before they abolished that course. And I just managed to luck my way into the industry purely by chance. There happened to be an opening just as I finished university, and I jumped on it. So I worked for Cerebral Fix down in Christchurch for 5 years until I saw an opportunity to go and work in Germany for a company called Good Game Studios, where I worked for a year before they spontaneously combusted. And then I returned to New Zealand to work with Pickbot as a senior game developer. And that's where I am now. Yeah, this is Pog. I'm just going to start with a note about terminology. Different companies call tutorials different things. So the term that is officially defined is a tutorial is an interactive method of transferring knowledge. So that can be any number of ways of transferring knowledge. It's just a way of teaching the people who are playing your game about your game, usually in an interactive manner. So Pickbot uses the term NUF, or New User Flow. Good Game Studios use first-time user experience. I don't like either of those terms because they imply that you only care about new users, which maybe they did because they're largely mobile games that I've worked on, and all they care about is getting them to pay some money, right? So I don't like those terms because if you've got a user who has reached level 100 and they've unlocked this new endgame feature, you still want to give them a tutorial on how to use it. You can't assume that they're going to use it. So new user funnel or first-time user experience, I don't feel a very good fit. And user journey is another one that someone gave me as an example, which I feel is a better term. So the first example is Terrapets. This is a game I worked on for a couple of years at Cerebral Fix. It is a pet collection game similar to Pokemon, but instead of having a character in which you walk around, you've got this grid-based map where you can place traps and objects, and the pets will appear in the trap after a set amount of time, and then you can catch them and fight with them. And instead of Pokeballs, we have cards, because cards were really popular back then. So, as I said, this is a pet collection game. It was released on iOS and Android. It's still available today. It's received some recent updates, I believe. And this was built on top of some prototype code, and it was about 2 years of adding features before the last bit of prototype code finally vanished, and that prototype code was very difficult to work with throughout the entire time that it was worked on. The tutorial system in the current version is a rewrite of that system, because the original one was not very easy to extend upon. It was basically on every button, there was a bit of code that said, if the tutorial manager is on, return, don't process this button. Which meant that every time you added a new button, you had to add that little bit of code, and it caused a lot of problems. Also, the button would still go into its down state and just not do anything. So we rewrote that, obviously. And this was the first tutorial that I personally worked on. So the design that we built this tutorial system around is that everything that can happen in the game is a command. We had commands for other things in the game, so this wasn't such a stretch. And we store these commands inside an XML file. Obviously, XML is not the best storage medium for data like this, because it's very verbose and takes up a lot of space. So we used XML because that's what we already had. We already had a system for parsing the XML, so rather than developing something new, we just kept with what we already had. And we use reflection in Flash to generate the commands that we needed to execute at the right times. Reflection is not the best thing. You don't really want it in your production code, but Flash reflection is kind of almost a special case because that's just how everything in Flash works anyway. And the tutorial manager is in charge of executing those commands at the correct times. So the code structure for this, again, is the XML has the commands. They get reflected and added at runtime based on the string of the command type. And other things use that command system. So the battle system, when one of your pets did an attack, it would be in command form. So the AI would fire a command to perform that attack, and when you clicked a button, it would fire a command to perform that attack. And each tutorial triggers the next tutorial when an event happens. So the event is just a string, and once it happens, it would process the next command in the queue. So that was based off the fact that Flash already used an event system for pretty much everything. So this is an XML file from Terrapets. This is an actual example. So this, I hope you can read that, is an example of two pieces of text. So this simply shows two pieces of text to the user. At the top, this page is one tutorial section, and it has some text that we show the user and has a character that we show the user. And then when we show this, we execute some commands. And the first command, or the only command in this case, queues a command to jump to another tutorial once the trigger is met. So the trigger is up here, and we go to queue this jump command when that trigger is met, and we will jump to this one. So this is a very simple case. It's just once you've read the text, we jump to the next one. But you can see already that this is a very large text file. Because of Flash reflection, you have to fully qualify all of your namespaces. And that's based on the folder structure. So what folder it's in is what namespace it's in, and that's just life. You have to live with it. So we had the convention that everything was in cerebralfix.games.name of the game, and then data, structs, commands, and tutorial. And it's a really long text file just to do a couple of really simple things. The code example is fairly simple here. It doesn't really do too much. Basically, each command is mostly in charge of doing its own things. So when a command gets added, the tutorial system checks to see what type it is and processes it accordingly. And as a bit of a summary on the Terrapets side of things, it's pretty easy to extend and add new functionality. You can just add a new command class, and then you can use it. The command can be whatever you want it to be. And it makes it a lot safer to create a new feature in your game compared with what was there before, where you had to check on every button because the tutorial was less integrated with the game. It kind of sat on top of the game instead of being embedded in it. And one of the big things that was an advantage here is we could content deliver it. So we could deliver a new version of the tutorial at any time to any user that we wanted. On the flip side, reflection is not a good thing to have in your code. This was all runtime validated input, so when you released a new version, if you made a spelling mistake, you could potentially break the game. And that's really not a good thing to have. Also, this XML file reached 1,600 lines for the entire tutorial, and this was not a complex tutorial. It was, do this thing, show this text, do this thing, show this text. It didn't have a lot of complex interactions that some modern tutorials do. So The next game that I worked on was Primal Rivals. This is a hero collection and hero management game with a tower defense as kind of the core gameplay. So we have this multiplayer map on the left, which is a hexagon-based map. You can attack any nodes adjacent, and if you win a tower defense node, which has the number of waves, then you took that, and other players could then attack you to try and take it back. So this was written in C++, almost exclusively, and it's a cross-platform mobile game. So again, hitting your iOS and your Android platforms. This was put on hold during closed beta after a very long development time, and it's kind of still sitting there as something that might get worked on in the future. So put on hold is kind of a who knows when it'll come back sort of thing. And we had 3 engineers on this for the majority of the project, which was about 2 years probably. Though some of us switched to other projects in the middle of that, so it wasn't 3 engineers for the entire time. And the really cool thing about this tutorial system that we had in Primal Rivals was it was written entirely in Lua, which allows you to just have a text file, which is code, but it's compiled by the game at runtime, which one could argue technically breaks Apple's terms and conditions of content delivering code, but they never called us up on it. So, and we used a helpful little framework called Lua to allow us to have full object-oriented class structures within Lua. So why did we design it the way we did? We wanted to be able to content deliver changes to the live builds. So again, that kind of came from Terrapets. We found it really useful to be able to deliver changes without having to go through a 2 or 3 week release process. This worked for the most part. We did have a producer release a new version by himself over a Christmas break once, and that actually worked. He released a new version, he changed the Lua himself, he had no code input, he just managed to release it. And we could also A/B test off the top of that. So if you're not familiar with A/B testing, it's the ability to have 50% of your users do one thing while 50% do another, and see from the analytics which is better. And we could just do that by giving a different tutorial file to 2 different people. And we wanted to keep the game code sandbox. So the tutorial should know about the game, and the tutorial should talk to the game. But the game shouldn't know about the tutorial. It shouldn't care if you're in tutorial step 500 or whatever. It should just keep running, and the tutorial should interact with it. And additionally, the hero skills that we had in the game, such as, for example, ultimate skills like we have in MOBA, already use Lua for all of their skills. So we could build off the framework we already had there. The code structure we had for this, in order to keep that sandboxing enforced, was the C++ code was the game. It's just a game. It defines the methods that you have and what each creature would do. On top of that, we had bindings. So the bindings exposed specific methods from the C++ to Lua. So rather than just having the bindings defined directly in the C++, we had this extra layer of abstraction which kind of forced our sandboxing. You had to define which methods you wanted. This prevented the designers from being able to access everything until we had explicitly exposed it, which meant that it was very sandboxed. They couldn't break things that we hadn't explicitly tested first. And then there's the Lua code, which uses those bindings, which I've got on the next slide. As an example, to run the C++ code. So this C++ here, this is a header file, and it is the screen manager binding. So we had a screen manager class, which handled how you transition between screens, but we didn't want to expose all of its methods to Lua. We only wanted to expose the ability to transition to a screen, check if the screen is shown, get a specific screen also as a binding, so we could only access certain methods of that. So that bit up the top is the binding that wraps that. So each of these methods would call directly into the other C++ code. And this bit at the bottom, with all this pretty commenting, is the binding itself. So this all uses C++ macros through Lua to expose these methods. If you're not familiar with C++ macros, they generate code at compile time. So this just makes this a lot smaller than having to write out the entire block. And we have this custom documentation language, which when you ran the script, it would go through each header file and generate documentation based on this, which was really handy. It did mean that for everything that we wanted to expose to Lua, we had to write an additional binding layer, but it gave us the power of being able to access objects directly from Lua. As an example of Lua, the left-hand side is, so once you've got a screen binding, you can then get a widget binding from that screen, which just allows you to get a particular UI element from within that screen, and pulse it, which in this case made it go fade from full color to white to back to full color, and just continue. So we pulse the divine essence icon, which is the currency we had in game, and also the text for that. And then we showed a tutorial panel. This was a sequence of panels which might have multiple steps. And then we wait until the panel is dismissed. So we just wait until the global panel is dismissed. And this is similar to how coroutines work in Unity, where you can start a coroutine, wait, and then it's done. And then once the tutorial panel is dismissed, we don't need to pulse the icon anymore, so we stop it. The right-hand side of this screen is a little different. We use this to initialize specific sub-games. So to initialize the tower defense, when you want to get the player to play a specific layout of your tower defense, we could create context for the game from Lua. So this runs the tutorial1.lua file and the run method within that, which is defined here. And this sets how much currency the user will have, which hero they'll have, which abilities their hero will have. You could actually give a hero an ability that they couldn't use normally in this particular case. And also sets up the creeps and any towers that were pre-built, tells you which towers you can use. And we use this for many things. We actually had a command line argument for the game where we could just deep link straight into a game to test a skill if we needed to. And we had a lot of power with this. We could test an ability that destroyed every creep on the map with a really overpowered wave. And we got QA involved with using this as well. So, in my mind, the Lua system is probably one of the better tutorial systems I've seen. Being able to deliver the Lua directly to the game, like our producer did, is really powerful, and because it is a high-level coding language, it's a lot easier than C++ for people to pick up. It's very flexible because you can expose whatever you want to Lua. You just have to write the bindings for it. And because you have to write the bindings, your developers who are working on the game have to think about how those bindings need to be designed up front. So if you're working on a new class, you have to think, oh, do I need a binding for this? What do I need to expose to Lua? Downsides, though, was this took quite a long time to develop the base systems. And sure, we had to have the Lua systems there for the hero skills anyway, but to build a tutorial on top, we had to expose so many more bindings that we didn't already have, because the screen manager wasn't bound. We in fact had 2 Lua sandboxes, one sandbox for just the tower defense game, and one for the tutorial and the metagame. And those macros at the bottom, they make things really hard to debug. Because the code is generated, you can't step through it because your IDE can't see the generated code. So you, most of the time, just end up with a chunk of assembly to step through. And you have to have at least some code knowledge, though the fact that the producer managed to make a change, admittedly a small one, is maybe a testament that you don't need that much code knowledge. So the third example I have is Heroes Realm. This is a game that I worked on for 9 months in Germany for Good Game Studios. This is a hero collection and hero management game again, with a slightly different core gameplay mechanic around where we had characters that just walked across the map and punched each other. So this was made entirely in Unity, with a server-side component as well. And it was cancelled in soft launch due to the sheer cost of trying to acquire users for a hero management game. This is around the time where games like Summoners Wars were really big, and it would cost about $7 US to acquire a new user, one user. And obviously you want hundreds of thousands. So we had about 100 heroes. A lot of these were just copy-pasted versions of the same one with a different skin, because that's a lot easier. And we had multiple environments as well. So we had 3 character artists and 3 environment artists working on this constantly for that time. We had 11 engineers at the start of the project. A couple left to work on their own project, so we ended up with 9. And the tutorial system got refactored quite a lot. What we started with was rushed into the game right before soft launch due to time constraints. We left it to the last minute. We only had 2 weeks to make it, so we hacked something together. But then we had to refactor it. But we also had to support the users we already had, so we had to refactor in such a way that the existing tutorial, people who had already passed the existing tutorial, weren't affected negatively. So the design here is theoretically simple. We have conditions of action. When a condition is met, an action happens. That simple concept blew out into something quite a lot more complicated, which I'll show you soon. So the condition we had was that only one tutorial can run at a time. We can have multiple different tutorials, but only one can be executed at a time, because the user can't split their focus. You can't tell them to click on 2 buttons at the same time. It's just not possible. So we did have multiple different tutorials. I think we've got 18 different smaller tutorials that were spattered throughout the game. And we didn't, like with Primal Rivals, we didn't want the game to know about the tutorial. The tutorial should know about the game, not the other way around. So the code structure we set up was, there's a tutorial abstract class, which you can subclass with specific tutorials. And this just holds a list of steps. That's all it is, it's just a list of steps. And these steps have conditions, but they have conditions for when the step is started, when the step is ended, when to disable the step. And there's actions that happen when the step starts and when the step ends. And we had 39 different types of conditions and 27 different types of action. Which isn't too bad when you consider that the number of bindings we had in Primal Rivals was probably quite a lot as well. So I felt the need to go over a quick example here. So the conditions for this tutorial, where we wanted to teach the user about how the auto skill casting system worked, which is if you have ultimate skills on your team, they cast automatically once their cooldown is expired. So you have to be in the fight mode of the battle. There's this preparation phase before that, and you can't access that button before that. We also wanted them to be past the initial tutorial to the point that they had reached the first world, Battle 6. So we didn't want to expose them to this new functionality too early. And the team had to have an ultimate skill, because the button's just not there if you don't have any ultimate skills on your team. So what we do when these conditions are met, we pause the battle, we show a text box explaining what we want them to do, and point an arrow at the button. And then we have conditions that say, wait, the condition is the tutorial message is being dismissed, and then we can move to the next step where we force the user to click the button, and the conditions are they click that button, and then we can resume the battle. And then that tutorial is done. I've just got a couple of quick examples of actions and conditions. So this is a simple action. It just points at a thing. So it points an arrow at an element. This gets initialized with an interface, which defines how the arrow can point at something. So if it's a 3D object in the scene, it tells you where on the scene it is, on the screen it is at a given time. And if it's a UI element, it can get it based on the rect transform. And a condition here is just doing a check to see if a certain pop-up type is currently active. So it gets the screen manager and makes sure that that pop-up is active. And if there's no pop-up active, then obviously the pop-up you're looking for. You're not supposed to be able to read this, so don't panic. This is the initial tutorial of Heroes Realm. This is a 500-line long C# file. Each of these comment blocks above the code blocks basically tells us what it does, which were required because it was really confusing. So each of these adds activate actions, activate conditions, and so on. And this is all hard-coded in C#. So it's not actually content deliverable, and not just because Apple says we can't. And it's quite difficult to follow at times. I mean, overall, it's not so bad because it is a linear sequence, but some of the edge cases were really hard to follow. So the structure was really tidy because each condition and each action was one class. You knew what they were doing. We followed the coding convention of one class with one responsibility. And it was actually quite easy to follow the steps sequentially and maintain it, except for the edge cases. Every little edge case we had to increase the complexity. We had, if you launch the game and you're at a certain condition, then we need to roll you back or roll you forward so that you don't see stuff that's no longer relevant to you. And those conditions, or those edge cases, made it very difficult to maintain, and our QA team was very good at finding them. And it is obviously hard-coded in C#, so you can't content deliver that. We didn't need to, but still it would be nice to have that option. And we're a server authoritative game, which means that the server executed the majority of the logic, but the tutorial was entirely done on the client, and the server didn't know about it aside from saving what step you were up to in which tutorial. So, something close to home. When I arrived in New Zealand again, after my 1 year in Germany, I started to work on Dungeoning, which is one of Pickpock's latest games, releasing earlier this year. And this is an idle clicker game, similar to Doomsday Clicker, if you're familiar, with a PvP element on top of it. And it had a very quick development time. From prototyping to release, it was about 6 months. Largely this was due to the fact that we could build off what we already had, so we could take some of the features that we already had from Doomsday Clicker and iterate on them to get something quicker. And we had 4 developers while I was working on it. And this is an entirely offline game. You can play it on your phone without being connected to the internet. And I think it's quite a lot of fun. You should all download it, because I say so. So the design that we wanted here was, again, we wanted it to be content deliverable. Now, we designed that in mind. We're not currently content delivering the tutorial, but we wanted to make sure we could in future if we decided that that was something we needed. As a personal goal, I wanted to build off what I learned from Heroes Realm. I really liked the idea of the conditions and actions system because it was really easy to follow and understand. But I felt that the way it was executed in Heroes Realm was too complicated and it didn't need to be. We also wanted to make it possible for designers to work on it. So all of the previous systems, you had to have some code support to work on. It was really hard for non-developers to work on it. And I really wanted to make sure that the designers could add tutorials without bugging me. Again, we had the restriction that you can only have 1 tutorial running at a time. So the code structure we had here was each tutorial, of which there were many, has a list of conditions. So instead of it having a list of steps, it just has conditions. And once the conditions are met, we run a list of actions. Now, the interesting point of difference here is the actions here can be asynchronous. This reduces the need for the start and end conditions. So when you start an action, it tells the system when it is finished. We also added an action that could wait for a condition to further build on the extensibility. So this is going to be very similar to what you saw for Heroes Realm, but this is an action. It's a little bit more complicated because this is an asynchronous action. So the perform method is called when this action is hit, and what this particular one does is it queues some text into the text box and waits for it to be dismissed. And then once it's dismissed, down the bottom here, it calls finish. And that tells the tutorial system that it can progress to the next action in the queue. I have an example of the editor. And this is a condition. This is basically exactly the same as the Heroes Realm one, where we just check to see if a particular pop-up is currently active. So this is the editor that we ended up with for the Dungeon Inc. tutorial. At this point, I didn't know about reorderable lists properly, so if you want to move something up, you have to tap the arrow. Anyways, there's always room for improvement. The left-hand side is a list of all the tutorials in the game. So each of those is very small. Unlike the initial tutorial, which is 500 lines in Heroes Realm, this one is, each of these just does one thing, or maybe 2 button presses. They're very small and very concise. But each one has conditions and actions. So this particular example, which I'm going to look over here because I can't straighten the neck like that, is we have the condition of that the previous tutorial has been completed. In this case, the wheel unlock tutorial. You can't spin the wheel until you've unlocked it. And we also wanted to make sure that they were on the supercharger pop-up, which is where you spin a wheel. Probably give a bit of background, but you spin a wheel to get a multiplier to your income. So you watch an IVI and then send it by the video, and then you will get a 2, a 3, or a 4 times multiplier to your income per second. So once you're on that pop-up, we want to do some initialization first. We want to award you a free spin, because we don't want to force you to watch a video during the tutorial. That would be silly and probably really disenfranchise you with the game. But we still wanted to teach you how to do it, so we give you a free one. We also force it to be a 3 times multiplier. Now the reason for this is a 2 times multiplier slows you down too much. You can't progress fast enough, and you might get bored of the game before you've seen the next tutorial. So we force it to be a 3 times one. And then we show these tutorial messages. So again, these are asynchronous. So we show this tutorial, which is this piece of text. It's all localized, and we wait for that to finish, and then we show the next one. And then we darken the screen once that's gone. So we darken everything except for the IVI spin button, which is the name of the button. And then we also limit the interaction, and we point an arrow at it. Now, that could all be rolled into one, most likely, one action that does all 3, but I kept it separate because there might be times when we want to just point an arrow and not darken the entire screen. So then we wait for the supercharger to be spun. That's kind of a custom action for a custom case. It's a very special case, and we just needed to know when it was started. And then once it's started, we can hide the darkened screen, so the screen is no longer darkened, and restore the interaction so you can click on things again. And then there's a nice little spoiler of this one down the bottom. We force the next multiplier to be a 4 times multiplier. This is because during user testing we found that users would typically go back into this dialogue because they knew what it was, and they might lose their 3 times multiplier, and they might get a 2 times instead. So we force the next one to be a 4 times just so that way we don't screw over the users, basically. This is horrible. This is the editor code that goes behind that. We've got enums for each of the action types and a factory based on those enums. I have ideas on how to do all of this better now, but at the time I didn't. And all of the parameters that you set in that pop-up get passed to the game as a string array, which isn't good, but because we have a custom editor, we can actually validate all of that input so we know what we're passing into the game. We don't have to worry about people modifying those strings. This is an example of how the view control works, which I thought was particularly worth pointing out. So if you're familiar with Unity, you can attach these scripts to all of your objects. So in this case, we attach this tutorial visual target script to the button, which allows us to find it in the scene, no matter what else is going on. And that, combined with the tutorial steps pointed out before, gives you that on the right, where there is an arrow pointing at a button, and that button is highlighted because everything else is dark. And these just map into a dictionary when they're enabled or disabled, so they're really quick to access. We also had a custom hit area and raycast system, so we actually didn't use Unity's built-in raycast system for a couple of reasons. One, we found it quite slow. By default, everything in Unity UI that is a text element or a graphic has raycast target set to on, and that's a pain because you have to uncheck it on everything in order to actually make the performance of each click usable. So I just had a custom one, and you had to manually add our component. So when we do the limit interaction, we actually just don't allow you to click on anything else. You can only click on this one thing. The other things are still interactable theoretically, but because this other one is like at the top of the list, it just overrides all that interaction. So, finally have a tutorial that designers can work on. Ryan, who is here today, has actually used this a couple of times to make changes to the tutorial. It is a much simplified version of what was in Heroes Realm. There are less edge cases to worry about, and it is just a very simple, you have conditions, you have actions. The tooling is quite easy to expand upon, but that is definitely an area that needs improving. It's very easy to add a new action and condition, though writing the editor code around that is a bit of a chore. And the visual system that I showed on the previous slide just allows you to decouple it from the UI, so you don't have to go find game object in the hierarchy by name. You just know that there is a game object with that tag somewhere in the hierarchy, and you can just access it directly. And this is great because artists like to move stuff around in the hierarchy, so if you're trying to rely on the order in the hierarchy staying the same, you're going to have a real hard time. And again, it's theoretically content deliverable, but we haven't done it yet. It's difficult to handle edge cases, but we didn't have that many to worry about because we're an entirely offline game. And the parameters are stored as strings. Again, not so happy about that, but maybe if I get to work on a tutorial in the future, maybe that would be the area that I would improve first. And the enum mappings make it a bit of a pain to add some new features. So, to summarize, there's lots of different ways of doing tutorials. I'm not saying any of them are right or any of them are wrong. They all have their pros and cons. In my mind, the best features that came out of all of these were to make it content deliverable. The advantage of being able to change it on the fly when you notice that your analytics say you have a 50% user drop-off at a point, and just being able to remove that step or simplify that step without having to release a new build is really valuable. It's better to have your input validated at compile time or at editor time. So rather than having a string that is parsed at runtime, you want to, where possible, have it validated in the editor or when you compile your code. This just prevents you from making silly mistakes. And designer-friendly tooling is very key because I haven't been bothered about that tutorial system since, which is really nice. And still haven't worked out a perfect system. There's still flaws, but I feel maybe a couple more iterations on what I've personally learned. Obviously, other people have worked with me on these, but from my point of view, what I personally learned is getting closer to a much better solution. So, just a couple of simple learnings. Don't hardcode your tutorials. You can't content deliver them. It seems obvious in retrospect, but it's so easy when you're writing game code to just put code everywhere. And avoid coupling. Again, you don't want your game to know about your tutorial. It's not a useful thing when you want to make a new feature and you have to write code to check whether your tutorial is in the right state. And keep it simple. A good example there is when the Heroes Realm tutorial modified became the Dungeon 8 tutorial, and that's a much simpler system. It has less bugs, it's much more stable, and it's just simpler. So why would you make something really complicated when you don't need to? And counter to engineering principles, for tutorial systems, I don't think you can design them for reuse. You shouldn't be trying to create a blanket tutorial system that works for everything. You will frequently find you have to rewrite everything anyway. So you might as well just design for the game that you're working on, rather than trying to design something that will work for every game you ever make. You can reuse principles, but you can't reuse the code 90% of the time. And in my mind, a good tutorial system is flexible because games change all the time. You add new features, you remove features. It needs to be extensible because you have to add new tutorials for your new features at drop of a hat sometimes. It needs to be stable, so again, simplicity helps with the stability. So anytime you have a bug in your tutorial flow, you're going to lose a lot more users than if you have a bug when you're at level 100 in the game. Because once you're at level 100, you already know how the game works and you can probably tolerate a bug or two. But if it's a new user, you're really going to notice. And ease of use. You have to be able to use this. You don't want people to try and work around it every step of the way. You don't want people fighting your tutorial system. You want it to be something that people can embrace and use and enjoy working with. And this is just reiterating the points. It's useful to design up front, but don't over-engineer. Don't take shortcuts because you're going to introduce bugs and edge cases. And also, talk to all interested parties. This includes art and design, because your artists are going to want to animate your panels and do all sorts of fancy effects. And you need to know that up front, because if you design a system that doesn't support that, you're going to have a hard time in a couple of months when you go to polish. Thank you very much. I'll take about 5 minutes for questions.
I was wondering at what stage of the production you start working on designing the tutorial?
So the question was, what stage of production do you start working on the tutorial? The answer is it varies. Heroes Realm was a bad example. We started on it about 2 weeks before the soft launch phase, which was terrible. But equally, your game has to be far enough along that you can have a tutorial. If you have placeholder buttons, it might not make sense to put a tutorial around them. But if you want to use a test, maybe you want to build your tutorial earlier so you can test that those buttons work or test the layout of your UI. It really does depend entirely on what you want out of it. There isn't a simple answer of, oh, work on it 2 months after release. It's probably a good time, but it's not going to work in all situations because you might want to start user testing 3 months before release. So it depends entirely on the case.
Yeah, you mentioned repeatedly, I guess, content delivery of tutorials, which is something like I build a bunch of tutorials, I admit on content delivery, but you're obviously very passionate about it. What kind of stuff would you deliver for like a tutorial change? What's important enough for you to actually go through trouble like changing something?
So the big thing there is, if you look at your analytics and you notice this would be a drop-off during your tutorial, like maybe with the Terrapets example, we put the user through 2 battles at the start of the game. They have to fight 2 Terrapets battles. And maybe we find out that we lose 50% of our users during the second one because it's a negative experience. They have to lose that battle. So maybe we decide that we don't want to lose that many users, but we don't want to spend weeks before the next update. Maybe your next update is scheduled a month away, and you want to fix that really quickly. So maybe you just remove that second battle entirely as a content-delivered change. It does depend entirely on the data you're getting back from your analytics, but there is definitely many benefits to doing it. Not sure if that answers your question. You can always talk to me afterwards. I'm around all day.